Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome. From all the scary headlines we see, it's easy to get the impression that this world is a fearful place, littered with angry men and loose guns. But that's not everywhere. Public health interventions in one sprawling region have largely avoided, and at times even reversed, the steady proliferation of illegal firearms and death by gunshot. Since communities of the Southwest Pacific decided to destroy guns and to remain unarmed, the reduction in firearm injury has been dramatic. For many decades, death by gunshot was seen almost exclusively as a crime problem. Most of the proposed solutions fell into the bottom-of-the-cliff variety, after-the-fact law enforcement and retribution. But from a public health standpoint, guns are to gun violence as the mosquito is to malaria. Bullets and firearms are the agents of harm, and instead of waiting to apply the law after the fact, we now have a range of well-proven injury prevention measures, just as we do for the road toll, tobacco-related disease and HIV/AIDS. And if holistic, best practice firearm injury prevention has been entrenched anywhere, it's in Australia. Back in 1996, the country had a serious problem, and it wasn't just a single gun massacre. In 10 years, the country had seen 11 mass shootings with more than 100 dead. Most were killed with a semi-automatic rifle, and 2/3 of the killers were licensed gun owners firing legally held firearms. And it still surprises some to hear that 87% of those killers had no history of violent crime, and 2/3 had no history of mental illness. During those years, much of the advocacy for gun control came from the Sydney School of Public Health. A handful of safety advocates and lawyers worked away at policy change with no change in sight. Their warnings fell on deaf ears. Despite reams of evidence-based research distributed to policymakers, the gun lobby had more influence with politicians. Finally, on 28th of April 1996, in the Broad Arrow Cafe at Port Arthur, one young man killed 20 innocent people with just 29 bullets in the space of only 90 seconds. The final toll was 35 people shot dead and 18 seriously wounded. Later, when the killer asked if he got the world record for a mass shooting, he was told he probably had. In Australia, attitudes to firearms and gun laws hardened overnight. After a decade of very public gun massacres, Queen Street and Hoddle Street in Melbourne, Strathfield Plaza in Sydney, Port Arthur was simply the last straw. Australians had seen enough of men with a grudge gaining easy, mainly legal access to rapid-fire weapons originally designed for the battlefield. This cartoon is typical of the swing in public opinion. It's easy to forget how quickly it all happened. Just 12 days after the Port Arthur shootings, Conservative Prime Minister John Howard's first major act of leadership, and by far his most popular, was to announce nationwide gun law reform. In those 12 days, and in the months that followed, years of work by lawyers, the public health community, church and women's groups suddenly paid off. Every few hours we heard our old fact sheets and articles being cited by politicians and journalists all over the country. Plagiarism never felt so good. Until then, the gun lobby in Australia had been a powerful force. During the Port Arthur debate, they admitted taking money and advice from the National Rifle Association of America. They dominated advice to government, and they ran an energetic disinformation machine. Some gun owners also threatened violence. At one rural meeting, when John Howard defended his gun ban, for the first time in Australia, a Prime Minister was photographed wearing a bulletproof vest. But the shooters had been marginalised by a national hardening of attitudes to firearms and to their owners. Urged on by opinion polls showing 90 to 95% support for gun control, the federal government kept its promise and pushed through an agreement between Australia's 9 jurisdictions to enforce restrictive and uniform gun laws right across the country. A ban on rapid-fire rifles and shotguns, a proven genuine reason to possess each firearm with self-defence specifically excluded, a ban on private gun sales to compel registration, and gun owner licences and the registration of details of each firearm to be linked nationwide. The states and territories also agreed that the same requirements would apply to compulsory gun owner safety training across the country, a minimum 28-day delay to acquire either a licence or a firearm, safe storage of both guns and ammunition in separate locked receptacles, and police powers to inspect storage at any time, cancel a licence and confiscate firearms, and to remove guns in high-risk situations. In the same months that they redrafted dozens of acts and regulations to comply with the new national standard, each state and territory also teamed up to achieve the world's largest and most successful reduction in the firearms stockpile of any nation. In the main federal gun buyback immediately after Port Arthur, 750,000 newly prohibited semi-automatic rifles and shotguns were purchased by the government from gun owners at market value and destroyed. 6 years later, following a shooting at Monash University, the national handgun buyback did the same with 68,000 handguns, that's pistols and revolvers. But what's often overlooked is that in the years after the Port Arthur massacre, tens of thousands of gun owners also voluntarily surrendered non-prohibited firearms without asking for compensation. As a result, at least another 210,000 guns were destroyed for a total of more than 1 million firearms. And that's a very conservative estimate. Although we can only guess the size of the national firearms stockpile before these buybacks, it seems likely that the proportion of private guns destroyed was nearly 1/3 of the country's civilian firearms. And the cost, a 1-year Medicare levy of 0.2%, collected about $15 from each taxpayer. To add perspective, a similar effort in the United States would require the destruction of 90 million firearms. So in terms of public health and safety, what's been the result? In the 18 years before the national firearm buyback from 1979 to 1996, gun suicide and gun homicide rates were already on their way down. This was a common pattern in wealthier nations. The main firearm buyback is indicated by the vertical line. Then the downward slope continues. One study concluded that all types of gun death at least doubled their rates of decline. Now, researchers stop short of claiming that Australia's public health intervention on its own caused the drop in gun deaths. But measured against the original targets, here's what followed. The first priority declared by government was to reduce the risk of mass shootings. The second, broader target was to reduce the much more common overall risk of gun death and injury. And the results? 22 years without a public mass shooting, the risk of dying by gunshot has more than halved, and there's been no substitution of method. Murderers simply did not switch to other weapons. The same was true of suicide, which makes up 3/4 of firearm-related death in Australia. One study of the rate of gun suicide found that the gun suicide rate fell by almost 80% after the buyback. The same study found that Australia is likely to have saved itself 200 deaths by gunshot and $500 million in costs each year. Now, there's still some debate about findings like these. For example, this study found the buyback had no influence on gun homicide. Then just last year, a 20-year study in the Journal of the American Medical Association concluded that Australia's gun controls were associated with fewer gun deaths, but it wasn't possible to be certain that one caused the other. Although today's politicians and journalists almost always cite one simple contrast, that's 11 mass shootings in the decade before gun law reform and 0 mass shootings in the 2 decades after, no one suggests that Australia's gun problems are over. Granted, 1 million firearms were destroyed. Yet in the past 20 years, Australian arms dealers imported and sold more than 1 million new firearms. When gun owners were forced to sell their banned semi-automatic rifles and shotguns to the government, many used the cash to buy a replacement single-shot firearm. The spike on the left shows a large increase in gun dealer imports. Then the domestic arms trade crashed. Gradually, sales picked up again. By mid-2015, Australians once again owned as many guns as they had before Port Arthur. But in the same 20 years, Australia's population increased by nearly a quarter. So today, on a per capita basis, the rate of registered firearms per 100 population has remained almost static, and Australians still own 23% fewer firearms than they did before the massacre. And here's a surprise. According to all the polls that asked the question, in the past 30 years the proportion of Australian households with one or more firearms fell by 75%. How can this be? Well, it's because the people who bought more firearms were the same people who already had firearms. Those who own guns are buying more, while those who own no guns are becoming more numerous. This trend is international. Even Americans report a steady decline in household gun ownership over the past 30 to 40 years. But now I'll turn to the Pacific, and it's not all Gauguin paintings. Across many islands, guns have emerged as a prominent vector of violence, injury, social dislocation and healthcare disruption, most recently in Bougainville, the Solomon Islands and mainland Papua New Guinea. Just to the north of us, intergroup and tribal disputes once settled with bows and arrows are often fought with assault rifles. In Papua New Guinea, firearms are common tools of intimidation, interpersonal problem-solving and resource allocation. We call that armed crime, and it's not good for public health. The PNG Medical Journal said that violent injury had become an epidemic out of control. Doctors were treating 5,000 gunshot cases, and this was a bigger problem than HIV/AIDS. In Papua New Guinea and many other developing nations, firearm violence also brings social disadvantage. Vendors and buyers are kept away from markets, children kept away from schools, and patients from healthcare. Gun owners are right, of course. It's not the mere presence of a gun which causes the injury. While firearms and bullets are the enablers, the root causes of armed violence are much deeper and long-term. Papua New Guinea's Bougainville War focused on resource conflict. It lasted 9 years and resulted in 12,000 to 15,000 deaths. Finally, an agreement tied to aspirations for a separate national identity made gun control a first key to peace. It was around this time that a broad consensus emerged among Pacific stakeholders that the security and destruction of firearms were essential prerequisites for human security, for good health and prosperity. Now, for the rule of law and human rights to be re-established in Pacific conflict zones, for healthcare and other essential services to be accessible, for good work to proceed in a safe environment, illicit firearms and ammunition are seen as the most immediate impediment to recovery and redevelopment. So much so that when the troops and police of the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands arrived in Honiara in 2003, the number one priority of all the Ramsay governments, with no audible argument, was the immediate collection and destruction of firearms. And they did it with glee. Amid overwhelming public support, more guns were destroyed than the country even knew it had. By law, the Solomon Islands are now gun-free, and they're not alone. In 3/4 of the countries in our region, police patrol unarmed. 5 countries and territories ban private possession of firearms. 11 of 20 Pacific countries and territories have no military. And this region has the world's highest per capita rate of firearm destruction. Remarkably, what I'm calling the Pacific Consensus for Disarmament emerged without government coordination. Our region almost unconsciously forged a new way. Island nations have both resolved in law and been actively encouraged to disarm the neighbourhood. Across the world, this popular bumper sticker suggests the opposite. To create a civil society to enforce peace, first add more guns. So how does this work internationally? 7 to 8 million firearms have been sent to Iraq. The US Government Accountability Office examined just a small segment of those and reported that as many as 200,000 could be in the hands of insurgents. By contrast, here's the more Pacific approach. When he landed his soldiers in Dili, the capital of Australia's island neighbour Timor-Leste, the commander of our regional police force was asked his first priority. Brigadier Mick Slater said his soldiers would disarm local gangs, the military and the police, in fact everybody in Dili. And they did just that. Of course, this cannot work for everyone. the world's major illicit drug and arms trafficking routes bypass our region. Gang violence is not endemic, and we haven't seen a major local conflict since the 90s. But for now at least, our regional bumper sticker reads, "An unarmed society is a polite society." Time magazine published this cover nearly half a century ago, in June 1968. That's how long some Americans have been saying that deaths by gunshot should be as amenable to public health intervention as the road toll, drink driving, tobacco-related disease, and curbing the spread of HIV/AIDS. Today's obstructions to gun control are much the same. Industry and self-interest groups focus on denial, then the propagation of fear and quasi-religious arguments. We've seen all of that before. But with gun violence, as with HIV/AIDS, waste of time notions like evil, sin, blame and retribution could be sluiced away to allow proven public health procedures. There's a sizable audience for this. In 2006, we wrote our first 10-year study of Australia's gun law reforms. That became the single most popular article ever published in injury prevention. Then The New Yorker called our 20-year study one of the 5 most notable medical findings of 2016. It's now among the top 5% of articles scored in JAMA. In the United States, both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton cited Australia as a gun control example worth looking at. Of course, that's unlikely to happen under the Republicans, so it seems that gun violence in America may now get a lot worse before it gets better. But just think of the advantage we still have here in the Pacific. This is surely the largest region on Earth which still has the luxury of prevention. Our peaceful home is where we hope public health interventions and professionals like yourselves will preserve the Pacific consensus for disarmament. Thank you for listening.